As I will be saying time and again, our next honored guest is no stranger to Hillsdale College. He's an old friend who has participated in our Ludwig von Mises lecture series on previous occasions, and we're honored to have him return. Dr. Israel Kirzner is the professor of economics at New York University. He was born in London and lived in South Africa as a child. He received his BA summa cum laude from Brooklyn College and his MBA and PhD from New York University, where he studied under Ludwig von Mises. He is the author of 4 books and many scholarly articles. Dr. Kurzner currently is a member of the American Economic Association and the Mount Pelerin Society. Help me welcome, won't you, Dr. Israel Kirzner.
Thank you very much. I trust that it's not necessary for me to elaborate on how profound a privilege I consider it to be able to participate in this celebration. I'm most grateful to President Roche and to Hillsdale College for this kind invitation to present these remarks. As I see our professor's wonderful life's companion, Margaret Mises, who gave us such a magnificent presentation earlier this afternoon, I think back to more than a quarter of a century ago to the years of Mises' New York University seminar. Mrs. Mises' gracious personality in the background of the seminar room was one of the seminar's memorable features. One never forgets how, punctually when the clock reached 10 minutes after 9, Margaret Mises would be sure to catch the professor's eye to convey the urgency of the need to conclude the seminar forthwith. I can assure you that after an hour and 45 minutes of hard intellectual labor, we appreciated Mrs. Mises. Margaret Mises' work during the past 8 years to disseminate the Misesian heritage has won for her an independent place in our hearts. We admire and salute her. And I see here Professor Peterson, whose teaching during my first year of graduate study at New York University helped me properly value the privilege of being able to study under Mises. I still remember how, after the first evening class at Trinity Place, Bill would offer me a ride in his car in order to shoot up to Washington Square to be in time for Mises' seminar at 7:25. I owe a great deal to Bill Peterson, and I hope not to forget it. And I see my very distinguished senior colleague, Fritz Machlop, whose steadfast appreciation of the intellectual stature of his mentor has never faltered. This, especially in the light of Professor Machlop's own extraordinary contributions, has always been an inspiration to me. Let me reveal how I came to discover how mutual was this appreciation between Professor Mises and Professor Machlop. It was in the spring of 1955 that, at the conclusion of my first year of graduate study, a year in which I came to be profoundly interested in the Misesian approach, I had to make a decision. I had received an attractive fellowship offer from Johns Hopkins University. Hopkins was, at that time at least, a clearly better school. Should I accept this offer, or should I continue at New York University working under Mises? It was, I am sure you will understand, with some diffidence that I approached Mises for advice on the matter. After all, Mises did not have many students prepared to work under him on a doctoral program, and here I was to ask his advice on whether I should leave. Mises pondered my question for a moment or two, and then he unequivocally advised me to go to Hopkins. He did not advise me to do so because of the greater prestige that might be attached to a Hopkins doctorate. He advised me to go to Hopkins because Professor Machlop was there. As it happened, I stayed at New York University. But I've never forgotten this brief conversation with Mises, in which he displayed, I am convinced, personal self-denial in order to give what he believed to be sound advice to a student, and at the same time taught that student how highly he regarded Fritz Machlup. My theme today will be Mises and the Renaissance of Austrian economics. Mises was a towering figure. He represented uncompromising intellectual integrity, the courageous pursuit of ideas regardless of the crop of unpopularity which he well knew he would reap. His scholarship was extraordinary, his wisdom legendary, the profundity of his insights into social processes has probably never been surpassed. Much has been written about his passionate championship of individual liberty. It is only natural that exponents of the several different streams of social philosophy to whom individual liberty is of importance are each eager to recognize Mises as a source for their respective positions on the ideological spectrum. I, too, wish to draw attention to Mises, the proponent of individual liberty, but I wish to do so in a context for which matters of ideological emphasis are, nonetheless, wholly irrelevant. Let me explain. A number of writers have, on occasion, claimed to have perceived a contradiction in Mises. On the one hand, Mises was an outspoken exponent of the Weberian view that economic science can and must be wertfrei. Economic science can and must be pursued in a manner that carefully distinguishes between the personal opinions and value judgments of the economist and the objective, interpersonally valid conclusions of science. On the other hand, Mises was the impassioned defender of the free market, full of scorn for the pretensions of central planners and interventionists to replace or supplement the spontaneous market with contrived arrangements by the state. It has seemed difficult for a number of writers to reconcile these different aspects of Mises. Yet, to anyone who heard Mises lecture on these topics, there can be no doubts concerning his position. There is certainly no contradiction in that position. For Mises, economic science is very definitely wertfrei. The demonstrations that wage controls tend to produce specific consequences, that rent controls tend to produce specific consequences, or that foreign exchange controls tend to produce specific consequences, these are not matters of opinion. They are the conclusions of science. Whether one approves or disapproves of these consequences, whether the fulfillment of these lessons of science be welcomed or feared, affects not in the slightest the truth of the propositions which assert these tendencies. Yet for Mises, economics does not operate in an ivy-clad vacuum. It is impossible to ignore the fact that these consequences do not, in general, coincide with the goals which the proponents of controls purport to cherish. From the perspective of these goals, then, these policies are simply wrong and muddle-headed policies. No doubt, in articulating these judgments, it was difficult for Mises altogether to conceal his own passionate sense of the human tragedy entailed by the pursuit of such bad policies. But what made these policies bad policies, in the view of Misesian applied economic science, was not Mises' own opinions, but the opinions of those who wrong-headedly sought to promote their announced goals by policies that tend to produce consequences precisely the opposite of these goals. Now, there can be no doubt that for Mises, the value of the value-free pursuit of economic truth was extremely high. For Mises, the systematic search for economic truths is an activity that is eminently worthy of human endeavor. This sense of worth had its source in Mises' passionate belief in human liberty and the dignity of the individual. For Mises, the preservation of a society in which these values can find expression depends in the last resort upon the recognition of economic truths. But paradoxically enough, Mises was convinced that these deeply held values can be promoted through the advancement of social science only if scientific activity is itself conducted as an austerely dispassionate undertaking. If economic science is to attain a credibility beyond that achieved by crass propaganda, it must earn that credibility by impartial concern for truth. The values to be achieved by economics require value freedom in economic investigation. How tragic, then, it must have been for Mises in the latter half of his life to observe the direction taken by economics. So far from economic science demonstrating those truths upon which, for Mises, the very future of civilized society depends, we had an atmosphere of professional opinion in which the prestige of science was deployed to deride the very possibility of spontaneous market solutions to social problems. In virtually every area in economics, it seemed to turn out, chaos and misery were shown to be bound to ensue unless market forces are curbed, redirected, or superseded by the firm, benevolent hand of an all-wise government. For Mises, these sadly mistaken conclusions meant a twofold tragedy. First, they represented serious error in the understanding of economic phenomena. Second, they constituted a tragic perversion of science for ends diametrically opposed to those which, for Mises, confer worth and beneficent purpose upon the disinterested study of economics. The possibility that today, as we mark the 100th birthday of our teacher, the climate of professional opinion may to some extent be changing, offers us an opportunity to appraise the place of Mises within the broader perspective of the history of economic understanding. Let us briefly recount part of the story of Austrian economics. When Karl Menger published his Grundsätze in 1871, the Subjectivist Revolution that he initiated against classical economic theory was audacious and sweeping. This revolution was, as is well known, paralleled by comparable intellectual currents in England and in Lausanne, Switzerland. Jevons and Walras are, along with Menger, generally credited with focusing attention on the critical role played by subjectivist, marginal utility-inspired forces underlying the demand side of the market. By the eve of World War I, these new developments had become the established orthodoxy. Alfred Marshall in England and John Bates Clark in the United States provided the core of what is still today the standard body of microeconomics. Despite some recognized differences of emphasis separating the various major schools of theoretical economics, it was generally held that what they shared in common, especially as contrasted both with the classical theorists and with the anti-theorists of the younger historical school, far outweighed what distinguished them from one another. It seems fair to say that Mises, as well as other Austrian economists of the first half of this century, shared in this sense of fellow feeling with their colleagues of other schools. For Mises, the approving label modern economics applied to all the post-1870 currents of theoretical economics. It was this which appears responsible for the opinion, accepted at least in part by Mises, Hayek, and other Austrian economists of the time, that what was valuable in the earlier Austrian tradition had become benignly absorbed into the mainstream of 20th century economics by about 1931, 60 years after the appearance of Menger's Grundsätze, and at the midpoint of the century which we are today celebrating. Yet I believe it must be judged, and it must be argued, that this view, still maintained in standard histories of economic thought, has, since 1931, been revealed to have been profoundly mistaken. The course of mainstream economics during the past 50 years surely establishes beyond question, A, that what separated the early Austrians from their fellow economists elsewhere was far more significant than had been appreciated even by the Austrians themselves. B, that it was the complete failure of these uniquely Austrian elements to have been meaningfully accepted into mainstream economics that has been responsible for those massive developments in standard economics since the 30s that cast so depressing a shadow over Mises' later years. The historic contribution of Mises, I submit, was represented not so much, perhaps, by the magisterial works which he produced in 1912 or 1922, in 1933 or 1940, as by his courageous, lonely vigil during the arid decades of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, a vigil marked by a stream of unpopular books and papers, and by patient, unperturbed teaching and lecturing to whomever he was able to influence. It was this painful, unappreciated work which kept Austrian ideas alive during the years of Eclipse. It was surely only as a result of this work that most of us who are here in Hillsdale today are indeed here. And it is as a result of this work, I have reason to hope, that we can look to a resurgence of awareness on the part of economists generally of the fundamental Austrian insights and of their crucial importance for economic understanding. Let us recall that oft-quoted sentence of Hayek's in which he suggested that it is probably no exaggeration to say that every important advance in economic theory during the last 100 years was a further step in the consistent application of subjectivism. The legacy of Karl Menger was one to which subjectivism was the very essence. The direction in which the Austrian tradition pointed was one leading almost inescapably to more and more consistent application of the subjectivist insights. And it was, to cite Hayek once again, Mises who, moving ahead of his colleagues, carried out this development most consistently. What I wish to suggest here is that in the first half-century of Austrian economics, the members of the school were themselves not fully aware of how deeply their subjectivism set them apart from their non-Austrian fellow economists. One is not always aware of the air one breathes. It was perhaps not until Mises in his Grundprobleme of 1933 and Hayek in Individualism and Economic Order and in the Counter-Revolution of Science had articulated some of the more radical implications of the subjectivist approach, that it was possible to realize the extent of the gulf that separated the Austrian theory of the market process from the neo-Walrasian theory of market equilibrium. Austrian economics may have shared much in common with the economics of Alfred Marshall and of Leon Walras. But surely one crucial difference stands out. The latter schools, we are now in a position to see, pointed to a natural line of development that led to a positivist, instrumentalist view of economic theory, a view for which human purposefulness, error, surprise, and the subjectivism of expectations are matters of embarrassment. It was the Austrian tradition, on the other hand, that pointed in the direction of the consistent application of subjectivism. The realization that economic science, praxeologically conceived, fits not at all into the standard paradigms of the philosophers of the natural sciences is a lesson still not fully learned. Paradoxically enough, it was the eclipse of Austrian economics during the mid-20th century that has helped us glimpse the far-reaching truths contained in this lesson. During an era in which methodological individualism was forgotten in mainstream economics, in which scope for error or for entrepreneurial discovery was at least implicitly denied, in which clarity of theoretical insight was carelessly bartered for a pottage of econometric techniques, it was during such an era that Austrian economics came to appreciate the character of a praxeologically conceived science of human action. So that we have before us a most interesting episode in the history of ideas, a body of work, a unique approach to its field of study, decisively loses scientific popularity. From the perspective of the newly regnant orthodoxy, this now unfashionable approach is in fact perceived as a crude, introspective, discredited, almost pre-scientific line of work that has come to be replaced by sophisticated mathematical techniques and hard-headed empirical and econometric realism. And yet, that body of work not only refuses to die, on the contrary, its very unfashionability generates a hitherto absent degree of self-awareness and plants the seeds for its renewed growth and revitalization. Thus it was that during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, Austrian economics declined to permit itself to be relegated to the dustbin of intellectual history. Instead, Austrian economics identified itself with unprecedented clarity, not as a primitive approach displaced by intellectual advance, but rather as a unique set of ideas, the subtlety of which had hitherto escaped attention. Sooner or later, the richness of these ideas and the depth of understanding they convey would come to be appreciated. If there is hope today for a resurgence in Austrian economics, then the unsung contributions of Mises during the decades of Eclipse indeed assume historic proportions. There is, in fact, considerable room for hope. At the very time when mainstream orthodoxy has never been more technically sophisticated, more sensitive to the complexities of social interaction, there is deep unrest in the economics profession. Faculty members and graduate students perceive a yawning gulf between the smoothly oiled models on their blackboards and the seething reality in the streets around them. Self-criticism and bleak methodological introspection among economists, even among the high priests of contemporary orthodoxy, are becoming almost standard features in the academic environment. In this climate, Misesian ideas are finding once again attentive ears in the economics profession. It is exciting work to nurture these hopeful signs of Austrian resurgence. I am, for example, most pleased to mention, as Mrs. Mises kindly did, that this month my own New York University will conduct a scholarly conference in honor of the Mises centenary. During this conference, some 20 economists from all over the United States and Europe will gather in New York to discuss new work now being written in the light of Mises' own contributions. It is impossible, of course, to predict precisely where this kind of intellectual development will take us. But it is surely clear that the rekindled interest in the ideas of subjectivism, the replacement of a positivistic economic science by one sensitive to the methodological uniqueness that derives from attention to human purposefulness and to human error, are developments with which the economics profession will no longer in good conscience be able to refuse to come to grips. Out of this intellectual ferment appears to be emerging a sympathetic reappraisal of the ideas of earlier Austrian economics, whether in the area of capital theory or of competition theory or of monetary theory, that were ignominiously discarded from the mainstream in years past. Here, surely, Mises' historic role comes into focus in a bright new light. Mises was not merely the intellectual leader of the Austrian school during the central decades of the 20th century. He was, surely more importantly, responsible for rescuing subjectivism from an otherwise certain death in the chokingly hostile environment of post-World War II positivism. Looking to the future, I would submit, it is our obligation to see to it that indeed Mises will be remembered in the long sweep of the history of economic thought as the pivotal figure responsible for a late 20th century rediscovery of the fruitfulness and the subtlety of subjectivist economics. In this rediscovery process, the Misesian commitment to strict ideological neutrality, to an almost puritanical Wertfreiheit, must never be relaxed. And yet one senses it is precisely the truth that such a wertfrei pursuit of praxeology can reveal that would be likely to gladden the heart of Mises, the devoted adherent of the ideals of Western civilization, the passionate lover of human liberty. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those of you who saw me give directions before will rest easy that I won't try that again. I might advise you, though, of your next session. If it is the 5 o'clock session you are seeking, it will be held in the upper level as indicated. The upper level of the Dow Center is merely upstairs from where you had lunch. The 7:30 session will be back in this room. Dinner, for those of you who are involved, is served in the same place you had lunch. Second announcement of importance is that you heard reference to the bookstore. You may wish to walk through it, pick up whatever you would like. Many of the titles are available there that you've heard discussed, plus many others. It is out the doorway and down the hall to your right. Without my pointing, take another right. It's immediately at the corner, at the end of the corridor, once you go out to the right. You might wish to await the autograph session tomorrow, though. That will be an important endeavor outside this room at 2:30. Mrs. von Mises will be there at that time. Thank you.